Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Inclusive Employee Experience in the Finance and Insurance Sector. It's just gone 1 o'clock, so do feel free to drop into the Q&A box and say hello. We've disabled the chat feature today as we've discovered it can cause problems for some people using screen readers as well. So I can see that nearly everyone has arrived now. And I'm really glad that you could all make it. So that's brilliant. Thank you for joining us. So let's make a start. So hello to everyone and welcome to our Inclusive Employee Experience webinar. My name is Teresa, Workplace and Education Inclusion Consultant at AbilityNet. And today we have the pleasure of being joined by Ross, who's Accessibility Manager at Lloyds Banking Group, and Vina, who's Individual Members Lead at GAIN. And GAIN is an organisation who champion neurodiversity in the insurance, investment and related financial service industries. So before we get started, I will just run through a few bits of housekeeping with you. We are joined today by My Clear Text, who will be providing live captions, and you can turn on the captions using the CC option on the control panel. Additional captions are available via streamtext.net/player?event equals AbilityNet. And slides are available at slideshare.net/AbilityNet. And our website, abilitynet.org.uk/finance-insurance-webinar. If you have any technical issues and you need to leave early, don't worry. You'll receive an email in a couple of days' time with the recording, transcript and slides. So depending on how you joined the webinar, you'll find a Q&A window. If you want to ask our panelists any questions, do drop those into the Q&A area for us to address at the end of the session today. Any questions that we don't have time to answer today will be available on our website at abilitynet.org.uk/finance-insurance-webinar. Also, please feel free to leave feedback in the post-webinar survey as well. We always love to hear that feedback. So a little bit about AbilityNet. We are a charity and we are sort of a technology charity whose vision is a digital world accessible to all. And we work towards this vision via a number of services, and they are accessibility testing and training, education and workplace consultancy and assessments, free services through IT and accessibility help at home, and online resources, blogs, events and webinars. So we're going to start today's webinar with a quick poll. And the question is, what are the main challenges to providing an inclusive employee experience in your organisation? So I think that's going to come up shortly. So please select one or more of the options that you can choose from. So we've got recruitment and onboarding practices, teamwork and collaboration practices, performance and career development, lack of understanding of business case benefits, lack of awareness of inclusive employee experience, no or low senior involvement, procurement of inaccessible solutions or elements, and limited or no budget allocated. So we'll just wait for those to come in. Okay. And we like to keep quiet during those times so that it gives you a little bit of time to think. And so we've got some results come in here. And okay, so what are the main challenges to providing an inclusive employee experience? So the top challenge there is recruitment and onboarding practices. And that was 39%. 20% voted teamwork and collaboration practices, and then actually I was expecting to see those in order, but in fact we've got 57% here, lack of awareness of inclusive employee experience. So okay, so that's that lived experience there as well, lack of awareness going on at that point. So limited or no budget allocated. I'm just going to roll these down a little bit more. So I will read these all out to you now so that you can understand what percentages have been sort of like surveyed on. So we got recruitment and onboarding practices at 39%, teamwork and collaboration practices at 20%, performance and career development at 18%, lack of understanding of business case benefits at 31%, lack of awareness of inclusive employee experience at 57%, no or low senior involvement at 27%, procurement of inaccessible solutions or elements at 27%, and limited or no budget allocated at 29%. So those are interesting results there that we've had. And I do wonder whether they resonate with you as we go further on within this webinar today, this session. We also ran a short survey with our finance and insurance customers and social media followers to find out their experiences of disability inclusion and accessibility in the sector. And as I said, these results might reflect on how you feel as well. So if we move forward and have a look at those. So the question here was, what do you think are some key barriers that are preventing progress in this area? So the top 4 responses were lack of awareness of inclusive employee experience, lack of budget and no budget for external support, no or low senior involvement in disability awareness and inclusion, and lack of understanding of business case benefits. So they're quite disheartening to read those actually, and they kind of resonate with what the poll was saying as well. And often it's about that lack of awareness and the barriers that that occur as well. I've also pulled a couple of stats together which provide some food for thought. And I know that we've just gone on to one more slide, but I'm going to go back one slide and just read out some stats for you, which the first 2 come from Leonard Cheshire. There's 14.1 million disabled people in the UK, and that's more than 1 in 5 of us which will be affected by disability at some point in our lives. And furthermore, in a study by Accenture, the organisation that prioritised disability inclusion had on average 28% higher revenue, 100% higher net income, 30% higher economic profit margins, and 200% increased likelihood of outperforming peers in total shareholder returns. So that provides us with some food for thought as well. So we'll now move on to the next survey that we held and feedback on that. So I'm just making sure that we're all together on the right slide. So the question here was, how disability inclusive is the finance and insurance sector for employees? So interestingly, 61% said the same as other sectors, 22% said more inclusive than other sectors, and 16% said less than other sectors. So perhaps there is something around inclusive and accessible recruitment in these stats, or how to access support. Could also reflect how employees feel they are looked after with regards to changing circumstances. Disability can be permanent, temporary, or situational, and many also don't disclose a disability as well. And we move on to our last survey here. And the question here was, how disability inclusive is the finance and insurance sector to its customers? So 33% said more inclusive than other sectors, 44% said the same as other sectors, and 22% said less than other sectors. So do these results suggest that the finance and insurance sector provides some ways in which they support their customers? Is it that some employees are more empathetic towards their customers, but it's a luck of the draw as to who they speak with? Perhaps there isn't a consistent approach to inclusive and accessible customer service. For instance, a website that isn't accessible, can somebody with a screen reader access their content? Can that content or their account details be read on the laptop, but not on a mobile technology such as a phone? And is there more than one way to interact and communicate with somebody? Perhaps it's by phone, email, or chat lines. So we've got a few things that have come in there from the survey. So let's move on and meet our panelists for today and discuss inclusive employee experience in the finance and insurance sector. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Ross and Vina. So Ross, would you like to introduce yourself and then hand over to Vina, who will introduce herself as well?
Yeah, thank you. So thanks for inviting me along today. Really pleased to be here, and a really interesting few statistics shared there. So yeah, I'm the Group Accessibility Manager at Lloyds Banking Group, with I guess, quite a broad focus, but the three areas that I look at are sort of our partnering with our property functions on sort of accessible property, working with our technology teams to improve the accessibility of systems for our colleagues, and then working with our sourcing partners to try and at the front end ensure we only bring in accessible solutions. So that's a very whistle-stop short version of my job. And yeah, over to you, Vina.
Thanks, Ross. Thank you, everybody, for being on this call today, on this webinar. I'm Vina. I've been around in this wider sense of financial services industry for the last 25 years. I hold a PhD in behavioral economics, and I'm absolutely delighted to be taking part today because I'm a passive, rather than a passive, a very active advocate for neurodiversity as well as diversity of thought and inclusion in the workplace. I cannot wait to get started on this discussion, particularly because I believe that most of the polls results have got an awful lot of food for thought for us to discuss and engage with. And together, because it's not so much of a consistency approach, but rather of a collective approach, together find solutions that we can create sustainable sort of versions out of.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for introducing yourself. So we can then move on to our first question. So, well, with regards to looking at the questions, so it's depending on how you join the webinar, you'll find a Q&A window. So if you want to ask our panelists any questions, do drop those into the Q&A area for them to address at the end of today's session. Any questions that we don't have time to answer today will be available on our website at abilitynet.org.uk/finance-insurance-webinar. Okay, so we are going to move on to our first question here. Lovely, thank you. So our first question, what are the barriers to employment for disabled and neurodiverse people? So Ross, can you tell us your experiences about this?
Yeah, so I guess so from my experience, not me particularly as an individual, more me sitting on the side of the fence in terms of working for an organization and being aware in kind of what disabled people's barriers are. So there are numerous barriers, and you mean even in your introduction you started to talk on it. So simple things like is the employer's website accessible to all kinds of disabilities? So can somebody with a visual impairment, can they get screen reader? Can they tab through the pages? Somebody who might have more neurodiverse challenges, is the language in a language that makes sense? Is it easy to understand? What does the color on the screen look like? Is there too much information? We know in the UK that the level of reading isn't always as strong as we would like it to be. So is it written in a way that uses less jargon and is just simple around what is? Even the way a job is described in terms of, we often see words like this is a fast-paced organization, and then if you're somebody that might have a particular disability where you associate yourself with not being fast-paced, is that advert already telling the person don't apply here? It might not be intentionally, but that's the way that it can be taken. So I think the first barriers to kind of employment is the recruitment experience. Then even in the interview, does the interviewee know about making adjustments? Is the building that you're going to accessible? So there's all of those things. And then I guess the next step is like, once you get into employment, what adjustments do you need? How quickly are they delivered? Are they technical? Are they physical? Are they non-physical adjustments? So yeah, I think there's a lot of barriers, and some organizations are doing a really good job at this, and some organizations are on their journey. And I guess for smaller organizations, some of this is a much bigger challenge where they don't have the resources or the knowledge or the dedicated teams to support this. So yeah, that's probably a very broad answer. I could probably spend ages going into the detail, but I want to give Vina an opportunity to jump in there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you on that, Ross. Thank you so much. It's a very broad subject. It's about the digital and the physical environments and the adjustments that can be made. And really interesting that you brought all of that in together there in that response. Vina, what would you say?
I absolutely agree with you, Teresa. It's definitely the digital and the physical sort of environment. And Ross, 100%, even before we start talking about employment or employability, let's take a step back and sort of, look ahead on the horizon that's called a workplace. What is there between you and that workplace, making it an attainable request for you to join? Is it the way that you're seeing that the job spec doesn't fully apply to the way that you expect things to be produced or, I suppose, articulated? And when you do, should you sort of respond to it in every point, or at least you feel obliged to, you summon up your courage, you do send your application and you are selected. Does this interview stage, the psychometric tests and anything that basically includes itself into the so-called hiring sort of stage resonate? Is it somewhere where you feel you're being represented? Is it somewhere where you feel like you are going there with your full self on show? Do you feel like you need to mask, or do you feel like you're not being understood? Again, on the other side of this is the person who's recruiting carrying their own biases and their own sort of attitudinal expectations, probably the behaviors that should come hand in hand by a very neurotypical, and I'm speaking neurodiversity here, of course, neurotypical sort of design of the spec. And what if the expectations do not match reality, and do not match even more the practical sort of application of the job and the role that we're speaking of? Without sort of wanting to sort of digress too much, or indeed take up too much time to explain every single sort of stage, going through the door is already a big litmus test whether you would be able to sort of jump over the barriers. And of course, when you're there, it's great to have all the practical enablements and the adjustments. But there's another sort of item that we need to very much seriously consider, which is what's going to make you feel nurtured, psychologically safe, and be able to develop yourself into a progressive career sort of development, into something that obviously is going to give you the skill sets for you to realize your full potential as a human, over and above a person with a disability or a neurodevelopmental condition.
That starts very early on, doesn't it? Right from the beginning of that job advert, right from the beginning, to make you feel safe and secure with applying for that role, I think. And you've raised a lot of information there with regards to sort of like disability awareness, disability confident of the employers, and being somebody that's got all the information to be able to apply for those roles regardless of how they want to apply for it. So thank you, though. Those were very important answers there that you've given us. I think also sort of we're looking at the job description and the language that's been used and how to address those feelings of bias. So again, it's about that CV sifting stage that makes an impact, isn't it, really? So yes, again, I agree with you and all of those. And how is that interview going to occur as well? And I think Ross brought that up too. It's the digital and the physical worlds, whether that can be done differently in a way as well, and making sure that onboarding process provides that welcome that sets them up for skilling up and moving forward. So you've answered all of those brilliantly, both of you, in those responses, and covered all of those areas. I think so important. Sort of traveling to those interviews as well is key, isn't it? So whether somebody actually needs to travel to an interview, is there a different way of doing things? And it's about finding that right route, I think. So I think we can go on to the next question actually from there, because I think it sort of leads quite nicely in. So the next question is, how does your organisation approach inclusion and accessibility for staff? So Ross, what does Lloyds Banking Group do in this instance?
Yeah, so again, this is a broad topic that I could probably do a dedicated on. So I'm really lucky to work in an organisation that, I've worked there 21 years, and that's probably testament of why I'm there. But I guess now drilling into, this is a function that I've worked in for the last 8 or 9 years. So as an organisation, we do lots, and I think the first thing to recognise is, we feel we do a good job, but we're always striving to get better. We know there are things that we can always continue to develop and learn. So let's think about this from a kind of like top-down sort of approach. So the first thing we've got an executive sponsor of disability in the organisation, and that executive member sits on the board of the bank, so it's high up on the group's agenda, and he has a steering committee that sits under it, which is key executives that are in different divisions of the group that can make a difference in terms of inclusion and accessibility. So, for example, there's a representation from technology, there's a representation from our facilities built environment, so that they can understand what our colleagues are telling us and what the challenges are and the things that we need to work on. So that's kind of, I guess, the executive sponsorship. We have an employee resource group. I think they're known as ERGs, although I'm often more talked about our disability network, which is a network of disabled colleagues and allies. In fact, you don't have to be disabled to be a member. Anyone who is passionate or interested in inclusion in the workplace. So that's a place where there's two purposes for that. It's sharing of information and providing a network and community, but also it's the voice of our colleague. So we actively, as a team and a function and a business, engage to understand what they're telling us about what it's like to hear. So I guess they're the barometer of how good a job we're doing. We then have a really good workplace adjustment offering, which is available to people in the workplace, in their job, but also it starts at the recruitment place. So when people are applying for a job, they're able to indicate what adjustments they might need in order to be successful during the recruitment. Well, not the guarantee to be successful, but to put them on a level playing field. We have and then internally we have a huge workplace adjustment offering where we work with an external partner to provide the right type of adjustments, whether that's anything from a chair, a desk, to more kind of software, technology-based solutions. Even again, sort of neurodiversity support, mental health support. So we have all of that kind of like both the physical and the non-physical side of disability in our workplace adjustment. And I guess the other thing that's really unique about Lloyds that I haven't found in from networking in this kind of industry is we have a dedicated team. So we have a group disability, mental health and neurodiversity team, which is where I sit. We're a team of, I think at the moment, about 11 or 12 colleagues whose sole aim is to work with the group to dial up inclusivity and accessibility. So we're a separate function from inclusion and diversity, purely focused on the disability agenda. I'm trying to think of some of the other things that we do that just spring on to mind. So again, we work with external accreditations to see where we're at as well externally. So the Business Disability Forum, the Disability Confidence Scheme, and again, constantly measure ourselves against what their recommendations are in terms of being an inclusive employer. And again, I think that's a very high level broad overview. There are probably some things that I've missed there, but they're the top ones that spring to mind. And that's what an organization, I guess, can do. So whether you're large or small, if you've got somebody in your organization, say you've only got 2 board members or 2 directors, that doesn't make them aloof to the disability agenda. So it should be something that they're thinking about right at the top of their organization and baking it into the DNA of everything they do.
That's really very, very good, actually, that it's seen as important right at that top level, and people have got a process to follow to be able to get the support that they need, and it's an accessible way in which they can get it. And I know, having worked on that side of workplace assessments for Lloyds Bank as well, that you can access a lot of resources through the system as well, and that goes from the physical keyboards to the sit-stand desks and the headsets, the software as well, the dictation software, the specialist software for dyslexia as well, and then you've got the training to be able to support those people in using it, or even scripting, because some software needs scripting with some of the platforms that are being used too. So it's really a very, very helpful way in which people can continue to access their work by accessing those reasonable adjustments, isn't it? And of course, we're moving on to sort of embedding that inclusivity in a more accessible way with our websites as well. So thank you for sharing that. Again, it's you've spoken about the employee's voice as well. So again, really useful, and points of contact in which you have an allyship for people to come to, and not necessarily all of those people have disabilities. But of course, we know that not all people disclose a disability as well, and they don't need to. So we don't know whether some of those members have got barriers themselves that they're experiencing. So Vina, what would you say with regards to this response as well?
I love the attitude of Lloyds Bank in terms of looking after the individuals and creating a sense of support. You're not alone. There's people like you. Let's actually connect. Let's hear what's going to help you give your full self to the business. And also, very crucially, we have a top-down commitment. As in your own sort of poll, and in a raft of other surveys, people quite often do not see the committed C-level, the committed C-suite, or indeed the board of managers, who basically say, we recognize that as a business issue. This is something that very much correlated, positively correlated, as a matter of fact, with a high-performing culture. If you want to sort of have a very strong company of profitability, efficiency, et cetera, then you might as well go back into your performance index and try and see whether the human-centric elements have been captured. And when we're speaking about human-centric, we're not just referring on disability, neurodiversity, or anything else. We're referring to absolutely everybody who's considering themselves and is an employee. How can we make our organization inclusive for the people who are going through some difficult periods in their lives, for the people who do demonstrate cognitive diversity and differences in the way they talk, the way that they process information? How can we utilize the collective intelligence of organization? And perhaps if I can take one extra sort of 30 seconds to say, in our insurance, investment, banking industry, wider sort of sense, financial services, we're often speaking about knowing our customers. And quite often I ask myself, how well do we know our employees? How well do we capture data that basically tells us who's who and what is going to sort of enable people to give the best selves to the work? And quite often we have to sort of see that as a lifelong learning. The items that we as an organization can always utilize and adjust and amend and update in the same token as individuals work in order to learn more, in order to provide more, in order to feel utilized and to feel like they are growing within the setup. So for me, this is really how we can make ourselves inclusive. Commitment from at the top, awareness, and places where people can commit into creating communities, little pockets of mutual understanding and advocacy.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Yeah, advocacy there on the end there as well. Very, very helpful, because and that sort of like ensures that people have developed that confidence, doesn't it? So if we move on to the next step, because we're talking about the pandemic here, so it had quite a significant impact on all of us. It sort of gave us a different way of working, didn't it? And a safe pace to learn to work differently as well. And it kind of opened up doors, I think. So Ross, have there been any significant changes since the pandemic at Lloyds?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I think the pandemic obviously, came completely out of the blue, and we had to provide an immediate response to that. And there was, we had to move a lot of people's adjustments, especially the physical stuff and the soft, like, headsets, keyboards, chairs, desks, home, and we did that. And I think what has happened, I don't think it's at Lloyds specifically, I think there's now a recognition from organizations about the world of the office is different from what it was before. So actually we can provide more opportunities for people to work in a hybrid format. But actually, whilst that's great for enabling, for example, today, I as a person who's a wheelchair user with quite a severe disability, working at home has huge advantages to me from a kind of like not having to travel, not having to get up as early and all those things that fatigue and stress and using different facilities and relying on the inaccessible trains in the UK. But equally, there's also the flip side that you can become very siloed and very, how do you create that kind of like physical, this communication is great that we're doing today, this stuff, but it's not 3D. And I'm not saying, we hug people in the workplace, but there's that virtual hug that you get that thing. So what the difference is now as an organization, we're looking at how do we develop our workplaces of the built environment for the future. So I guess we talk a lot about future ways of working. And I think there's a desire to, encourage people to come to the office, but create an environment that helps them be their best. So, for example, I'm seeing a lot of work in our office design space around different types of working zones. So, quiet spaces, spaces where people might be able to adjust the temperature, or it's like, but also using real-time analysis in the future. And we're not there yet, but one of the things we're thinking about is like, if you're somebody who is neurodivergent and actually going and working in a place of the office that's quiet and away from people, how do you actually know where that is on a certain day? So using a bit like Google use, like our phones to monitor traffic. It's like, how can we use like kind of that sort of similar technology to say, well, actually the fourth floor in the corner is really quiet at the moment. Like that's a good place to go. We're looking at things like improving our toilet facilities, not just for disabled colleagues, but actually everyone. And this isn't about just disabled people. I think inclusivity is broader than that. There's lots of intersectionality. I actually was at an expo last week, NADEX, and actually I heard a really good quote, which I can't remember who said it, but I'm going to keep stealing it and reusing it. But it was, if you design a workplace for 80% of the people, you are discriminating 20% of the workforce. But if you design the workplace for the 20% of people who have additional requirements, you're creating a workplace that's 100% suitable for everybody. And I guess that's what I'm starting to see specifically, not just in Lloyds, but in other organizations through companies that I network with. There's this great desire, things like even entrances to the building. They're thinking, how do we create a secure environment, but actually just have one entrance for everybody? But how do we then make that suitable, not just for someone who's got a mobility challenge, but for somebody who doesn't like lots of color and lots of noise? And I'm hearing lots of things. So I guess what I'm talking about here is not necessarily what we're doing, but I think what the industry is looking at, what offices and large organizations that have got the resource are looking to do. I've heard things like, your smartwatch or your phone, if you're registered with your organization, again, and I'm talking a lot about neurodiversity here, but if you come into the office, and a lot of these offices you see with big colorful TV screens displaying all jazzy presentations, but that can be really like distracting, and like it can heighten people's barriers. And actually, if it detects that you've arrived at the office, it could almost switch that screen black for the 30 seconds that you take to go through the office and then turn it back on again. And I'm seeing lots of things like that. Biophilia, a new word that I learned last year, which is all about plants and vegetation in the office. That's another thing we're starting to see more of. And also like more sit-stand desks. Actually, some people as well really thrive in working in more busy environments. So we're looking at our restaurants and saying, actually, what traditionally was somewhere you went for a coffee or your lunchtime, kind of like 45 minutes, you might actually really thrive with that kind of environment. So let's make some workspaces in there. So I think, to summarize, what I'm seeing is a real focus on looking at how we create, the office for the next, 10 to 15 years. But you've got to be designing it in a way that you don't design it for 50 years, because we don't know what's around the corner. So we've got to be adaptive as well.
Yeah, I love the idea that you're getting a feedback as you're walking through, and things change for you as you walk through to make it truly inclusive, and less, it reduces that feeling of sensory overload as well as you're walking through. And the plants in the office and the sit-stand desk, that's truly inclusive, and being able to sort of like use different zones and know where those zones are. So how about you, Vina? What have you seen significant changes since COVID-19?
I will start actually with a big agreement back to Ross's sort of point with regard to the entirety of the industry. Again, acronym that stands for Group for Autism, Insurance, Investment, and Neurodiversity. We're working very close with our corporate members to look into the organizational and the physical sort of design of the new workplace. When we speak about the physical sort of workplace, that pretty much covers what Ross very eloquently described already. But I wanted to sort of take, again, my usual sort of step back and go into the notion of the lesson learned very quickly, the lesson learned out of the pandemic. So for me, it's been a lesson of also our own inertia. What I mean with that, we currently don't have to work from home out of a social responsibility or caution, but we still do. Why? Because many people will tell you that they'd rather work in a hybrid sort of environment, going to the office and working from home, because it suits them, their lifestyles, the family, or other personal sort of commitments, and it creates a good balance. I know also from our neurodiverse individual members that quite often they find that the in-between that they have from the workplace and the screen and themselves is acting almost as a support mechanism. It doesn't give them the kind of direct exposure to all the social sort of engagements that sometimes they find awkward. So they do like the balance. And this is where I'm asking quite often myself, inertia-wise, what is these underpinnings, the cultural and personal underpinnings that have disabled us, disallowed us, controlled us all along, all these years, from understanding there's a way to live life better, and we don't really need to wait for a pandemic to go out there and say, why don't we start working in a hybrid environment? I mean, that made me very happy when a few weeks ago I saw this article at the FT by Tim Harford, who was basically speaking about the new pandemic sort of world. Essentially, attitudes haven't changed, but we're now sort of understanding the value of the environment, the physical environment. In the past, we used to actually think, speaking of, corporate insurance, my most recent sort of, stop of the last sort of 14 years, so long as you're in the square mile in one of the sort of jazzy, glitzy sort of environments, you've done very well and you have a place that everybody wants to be. Well, it turns out it's not the case. It's the kind of visual sort of stimulus and all this kind of too much that some people actually find tiring. There's also, I love what Ross actually spoke about, the signposting, being able to utilize your space in a way that is already provided to the people without them having to go back to the reception every so often to get a floor plan, that they know where to go. They know the kind of quiet areas where they sit, or they know that if they want to avoid the strong aroma coming from, say, the kitchen area or the work cafe, they can move the workplace, the hot desk somewhere else. So it's all about the practical, but even before the practical, really, I'd like us all to spend a couple of minutes after this, during this webinar, to think what is really sometimes holding us back from the self-advocacy and from the sort of quest to improve our lives, our working lives, our personal lives, and the lives that actually makes us happy to sort of live and to grow within.
Yeah, I think choice came over quite clearly in that, having that power to have a choice of where you work and how you work seems quite crucial there as well, doesn't it? I think we kind of move on to question 4. What are some employee initiatives that facilitate inclusive and accessible working? Was kind of covered in that answer. I don't know whether you've got anything else to add there. Can we move on to the next question? Question 4, please. Thank you. Is there anything else that you want to add while we have a look at this question? So
I think the other thing I think the thing I've been recently involved with is that in this hybrid way of working, there's an assumption that technology makes it easier for people with disabilities, and actually, like we're implementing what are called MTRs, which are Microsoft Teams rooms across our estate. But actually, we've been doing a lot of focus groups with our disabled colleagues across all range of disabilities around how inclusive is that experience for you, both if you're sat in the home or you're in the office. So, for example, and I brought this to light the other day when I was actually part of the focus group. Also, actually, I've blogged about this recently, is that the pandemic for me as an individual and having Teams rolled out, because we went from using WebEx to Teams pretty much overnight, and I feel like as a disabled person who has physical barriers in terms of like things like raising my hands or doing a clap, Teams has actually made me more confident and more engaged. And actually, when I'm in a physical meeting in the physical space, because I'm unable to put my hand up, it's really hard for me to say that I want to go next. Where actually, in a Teams hybrid way, putting my hand up, people go, "Oh, Ross, you want to contribute?" So I think it's things like that. So we're doing a lot of analysis on this whole kind of like hybrid way, and how do we make it as inclusive as possible? Because things like in the image on your screen now of somebody standing there with a big monitor like a touch screen, maybe like, what if you can't physically touch the screen? What about, is the room large enough? What about the audio in the room? What about the seats in the room? What about kind of like, can you kind of the cameras that zoom in and out? Some people, find it really disturbing when the camera fully focuses on you. So we're trying to make sure again that we don't assume that these wonderful technologies out there are the solutions to everything that we need.
No, but actually the technology is really helpful as well, isn't it, Ross? Because you can, like, if you feel that the camera being on is a problem, you can turn it off because your name comes up, or you can have an avatar, can't you? If you need to use the emojis, you can use shortcuts as well. There's another way of doing it. So there seems to be different ways in which you can interact, and that hybrid sort of like working environment with Teams as well. You can be in the office and you can include people through sort of like using Teams too. But I realize that technology sometimes can be a bit of a hindrance as well to us. But it's evolving, isn't it? And constantly being updated and new things being embedded. So how about yourself, Vina? Have you got any thoughts here with regards to this question?
Yes, absolutely. For me, key, because we're speaking about the practicalities and the adjustments, if you will, for me, it's very important for us to make sure that we have a system whereby we can create a check-in, regular check-ins with people. Environments change, roles change, even line managers change. The fact that we've ticked the box once doesn't mean that's forever ticked. It's very important to have this circularity of feedback, of people being able to sort of know that if something is there that's creating unnecessary anxiety, they have a line manager who's trained, who's aware. Training almost sounds as if we're collecting CPD points basically to go through. It's not necessarily just that, much as obviously education is great to be incentivized. It's more about things that come from the heart, from the empathy of leadership. And I find it slightly funny, really, that some people refer to empathy as the new leadership sort of asset. I think it's always been there, but some people probably were feeling suppressed and not really very bold to use it. Being human-centric is part of you protecting one of your two major pillars as an organization. If we accept that one is data/technology, then the other one is obviously the human capital. So ways that we can create little communities. Quite often, again, we talk with our corporate as well as individual members as to what they can learn from each other. What have they learned from their own organization? But as you said initially, from the surveys, often enough, we don't even know what other organizations do. And there's nothing in their websites, in their social media accounts, that really denotes the level of the awareness and the sort of inclusive input they can give us, because we tend to all use pretty much the same language. Again, language, you mentioned, Teresa, is very important, but really, rather than saying, come join us, we're a very inclusive organization, how about saying, why don't you discover it? So be open, create this kind of circularity of feedback. Have the commitment from the top, but commitment is just more, as far as I'm concerned, than signing a budget, and I acknowledge budget being one of the barriers for some. It's also about representation. Surely, in our industry, we have 1 in 5 people, as we said, globally concerned or directly sort of referenced by disability. Surely in our C-level, we have neurodivergent individuals. How come that we don't see the degree of representation? By the same token, surely we have neurodiverse clients. Do they feel that we know them well enough to represent them? So it's all about pockets of community awareness, training that creates this respectful curiosity and check-ins, the updates of adjustments, because things do move very quickly.
They do move very quickly, and also it's that lived experience. And if you've got somebody that really isn't aware, going on sort of some lived experience course or speaking to people with a lived experience really does make an impact, doesn't it? Because you might not know how technology is being used or how that somebody's feeling a certain environment is impacting them. So understanding that lived experience is really one of the key things, isn't it, as well? Okay, so we've got another question here, and that's question 5. So what is done to ensure accessibility and inclusion of the digital environment, and what is the value of procuring accessible internal systems as well? So Ross, have you got any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, just reading the question again, quite a long question. What is done to ensure accessibility and inclusion of the digital environment? So we obviously as an organization are committed to again, the kind of, I guess, from a workplace adjustment and disability and inclusion point of view is providing employees with the right adjustments to access technology that they need. So assistive technology, and we've talked about this already on the call a bit today, but like things like screen readers,
it's the systems that you use, isn't it, as well? So it's making sure things are compliant with, like, the WCAG compliancy or a VPAT statement on the software that you procure as well. So it's making sure that those are in place. But some systems have been within the sector for a long time. So it's how that technology that you have to buy in that supports it too. So you might have to have scripting to be able to use it as well. And that's something we've seen within the workplace quite often when we do recommendations, is that there's often a bridge to cover that gap. So Vina, have you got any thoughts here as well? Have you got any thoughts on this?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be slightly provocative in the sense that quite often in insurance and banking, we speak about having one too many softwares, one too many systems that ultimately create inefficiencies because we don't have a massive budget to be allocated for every single one of them, yet we go sometimes over purchasing. We don't know how to align, and ultimately you end up with a few idle systems. I see pretty much similar circumstances with the assistive technology. There's many social enterprises, which is great news, and many tech startups that profess to improve our life qualities and give us assistive technology that's really worth using. Question is, how well do we know our organization? How well do we know our employees? How well do we know what exactly we need to procure for? How well have we pitched up to the board to get the necessary budget? Is a budget representative of the goodness, again, the business case? It's all very circular, isn't it? The business case that this is enabling, and the people whose performance is going to be no doubt amplified by that. Small example, and I've seen that Ross has already raised his hand. So
yes, he has. Yeah.
I want to give you space, but I want to sort of following on to the provocative sort of stance, at least for this question, is do we know the technologies also in terms of how they need to be paired up by the regulation and any updates, government awareness? An example, LiveScribe Pen. We have one of our individual members, again, who says, I love the meetings that we do virtually, obviously nowadays. And of course, it's great when you are able to take notes at the same time. But guess what? My processing sort of ability to be really an active listening as well as take notes is somewhat compromised. So I use the LiveScribe Pen to take the notes for me. I give a word and then it basically captures the rest. However, there's a little sort of pocket that's called GDPR. What do you do there? Quite often he has to open a discussion by producing the disclaimer sort of statement and saying we're not sort of, using that outside the remits of this panel. But still, it is met quite often with a lot of disbelief. We're
There's a
finding
few
that
barriers there, isn't there? So
Exactly.
like live scribe pen could well be a GDPR issue as well. So, and security issue as well, because it's something that goes down on paper and
I
is
fully
there to
agree.
be seen.
But my sort of last point to that, as an example, could be, how can we make sure that everything that we use is, yes, compliant, but it's compliant for the right reasons? And we can all sort of, again, it's a collective sort of thing. It's all about my organization, your organization, their organization. It's about collectively doing something that's really sensible and sustainable.
Ross, you've got your hand up as well, and I'm sure you've got some extra things to say here as well.
Yeah, so I think, so one of the things three things I want to call out. So we've got for our internal development of systems, we have a toolkit for designers around what does accessibility look like. So and there's an inclusive design guild in the organisation, but this very technical area that isn't my strongest area of expertise. But I know from my involvement, there's lots of forums and groups that get together and talk about all this techie stuff and share best practice. So that's one of the things we're doing in terms of and the guide to producing inclusive systems. We've recently updated our sourcing procedures to put more focus on this in the kind of tendering and acquisition part of systems. So like kind of looking at the organizations that we're wanting to work with mirror what we're trying to achieve. So we've upped that standard. We're still looking at doing more work there. And then the third thing is like identifying the systems that we've got. I think you talked about it at the start. Some systems have been around for a long time, and it's working with the vendor around what is the roadmap to, not having workarounds or not having to rely so heavily on things like scripting. So again, we're working on like a plan, I guess, a path to green with existing vendors and through regular sort of supplier governance meeting where accessibility is part of it. So I think those are three things as well that we're doing to ensure, better inclusion in the digital space.
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant, because some of those old systems, they haven't got accessibility built in because they're so old, aren't they? And, even down to having a look at a piece of text that's in a piece of software, it can't be magnified. And quite often you'd recommend a larger screen for somebody to look at just to try and bring that resolution up for them, so it's a bit larger, because as we age and we're an aging workforce, we want to see text that's a little bit bigger, and we have glasses and things, so and we're all being asked to work a little bit longer as well, so there's going to be a lot of barriers that are going to be created. So yeah, those legacy systems are quite difficult to make changes to. So procuring at the beginning where accessibility is built in is really important, but understandably there's costs to that, and over time it will improve. So yeah, thank you, Ross. That was quite interesting that you spoke about the legacy systems and what you're doing to try and overcome those barriers there too. Okay, so question 6. So, okay, so why should organizations help you create neuro-inclusive workplaces? I love this question. So, Vina, do you want to answer this one?
Sure, thank you. As I probably mentioned a few times already on this webinar, is a matter of collective intelligence. It's a matter of collectively us moving forward to the next sort of generation, evolutionary sort of phase of our industry. We need massively untapped talent pools, like people who have a disability or who have a neurodevelopmental condition, because traditionally these people have been ignored because of the barriers that we mentioned, because of other historical sort of bias, etc., etc. We need organizations to individually start ensuring that with their own affinity groups and ERGs and the commitment, as we said, from above, and the neuro-inclusive sort of policies and disability accessibility practices, they sort of shift the dial. But what's very important is for us to engage in the ecosystem that basically has got the regulators, has got the corporates, has got the individuals, the academia, the trade unions. We need to acknowledge the fact that alone we cannot actually put it forward. We cannot at least make the change, the progress in a way that's going to be sustainable, is going to be there tomorrow. This is exactly what we are doing. We are championing again. We are connecting the dots. We're aligning all these people together to create the ecosystem of support and the ecosystem that gives voice to the people who feel marginalized, underrepresented, and are now trying to, again, by connecting in the little pockets of communities that they're having in their own organizations, in their own lives, in their own families, at schools, and social environment, bring it together and with their own skill sets and attitudes, which is very important. How often do we recruit for attitudes, the positive attitude, the courage, the boldness?
It's looking at those spiky profiles, isn't it? And where something's one way and something's the other, and we all fit together differently, and it's having that diverse group of people working together that's really important. I'm going to move us on because I want to get to the audience Q&A as well. So okay, so thank you so much for your input here. I'm going to bring up some of the questions, if that's all right, and to see what we've got coming up here as well. So bear with me for a moment, because my screen just suddenly changed as well at the same time as that. So it's quite surprising, that one. One of the questions here is, do you think companies are not serious about disability employees and are only forced by law to give attendance to this in their hiring? So anybody, Vina, what would you like to say here?
I'd love to say yes and no. I actually think, no, we're serious because we all have our own sort of personal references. We all have families and we all have a degree of connectivity in the wider sort of space of disability, neurodivergence, etc. It's actually what I think we are lacking at this stage, or we're now sort of on the journey for, is to ensure that we have the necessary pockets of an understanding of awareness, of training, to be able to move together. The legal sort of framework is great because it protects the people, but we need to sort of have it as a lived experience in our workplaces. And this is where we need to come in together.
Okay. I've got another question here. Ross, it's geared towards you and Lloyds, actually. How does Lloyds approach reasonable adjustments? You mentioned actioning these quickly is important.
Yep. So we have an internal process where colleagues, either in conjunction with their line manager or themselves, can just raise a request to have a workplace adjustment. And then we have an internal team that looks at the initial request and sees actually what's the most resourceful way and quickest way to give them their adjustment, because sometimes you don't need an assessment, for example. So somebody might come to us straight out of uni and say, hey, I've got dyslexia and I use this particular software. And we might say, well, that's not the software that we use. Have you used this software? Would that work for you? Or it might be that you use that software and it's a case of just getting it installed on their machine. It could be that someone's got a newly diagnosed condition and actually they don't know what they need. And we direct them to work with our external workplace adjustment provider who does an assessment. Or it could be that actually it's not a complex workplace adjustment. So it could be they're like, well, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example here. I need to work from home on a certain day of 1 day a week.
Yeah, something's easy to implement.
A conversation with them and their line manager.
Yeah, absolutely perfect. And I really like that you said about sort of like the students coming over, because they've gone through a DSA assessment very often. So that's disabled student allowance assessment, and have worked with equipment for 3 or 4 years. And work perfectly well with that, and to be able to sort of like take that on board as they go into their new environment is key to their success at times. And it's nice to hear that they don't need to go through another assessment to do that. So I'm just going to take us back to our training slides, because we've nearly come to the end here, and I'm very conscious that I want to share with everybody our training. And let me just move that one. So you can book any of these at abilitynet.org.uk/training, and there's some upcoming courses as well. So you can see we've got Introduction to Digital Accessibility, we've got How to Build a Disability Inclusive Workplace, which is free, both of those ones free, and Embedding Accessibility at Every Stage of the Project. And there is a 10% discount code for training for our webinar attendees. So save 10% on the 2023 training courses. Discount code is AbilityNet webinar 10, nearly said 20, it's 10. So, and then I'd like to say just a big thank you as well to Vina and Ross for joining us today. And in that Thank you. And we'd like to also sort of like say, please do complete the feedback form, which you'll be directed to at the end of this session, and also sign up to our newsletter as well, abilitynet.org.uk/newsletter. We have some more sort of programs coming up with regards to multiple sclerosis as well, and our Don't Disable Me webinars too, which is public sector focused. And again, big thank you to Vina and Ross for joining us today. It's been absolutely brilliant.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.